Genshin has a policy of never changing characters after release. Of course, there are some exceptions like fixing bugs or when community demands overwhelm them, but generally most characters stay unchanged. You may think since Genshin is a PvE game, balancing isn't as important, and yet sometimes Hoyo has to nerf characters that are too popular and compromising sales, or both those that are not. Today we're gonna look at how they are doing it and why such approach is amazing. For better understanding, let's start with examples and examine what happened in each situation, and who can be a better first target than Bennett. If you've been playing since couple years ago, you know that Bennett was the basis of pretty much every team, but nowadays he is less and less used. He hasn't been fully replaced by some character and is just as strong as back in the days, so what happened? You see, Bennett's main role is to buff main DPS by giving them huge amount of attack, and since Hoyo can't just make him weaker, they need to do something about main DPSs. Starting from Sumeru, they began releasing more and more characters that either have dual scaling or don't use attack at all, thus making Bennett and team with such DPSs less valuable or not useful at all. That way characters like Alhaitham, Noelle or Tainari would much rather prefer having another sub DPS. But of course that wouldn't be enough alone. To make Bennett even less present, they need to introduce more enticing alternatives. And the fact that the alternatives are not just a straight up power creep is very important, since it makes community more happy to use them. With Sumeru we got new Dendro reactions that could easily become big part of your team's damage. Fontaine on the other hand added Furina, who in exchange for massive buff requires a strong AoE healer in the team. Both are providing bigger DPS buff and therefore taking spots that would usually go to Bennett. By the way, these changes of course didn't affect Bennett solely, but also lowered popularity of shields and some other more niche supports. And lastly, pretty minor thing but still worth mentioning, new enemies. You might have noticed that lately many enemies deal big Hydro or cryo damage with one hit. Usually it doesn't deal enough damage to threaten your life, but with Bennett in the team things change. Since Bennett constantly applies pyro on you, it enables Mel to wait for their every strike, therefore making it pretty uncomfortable to fight against. Again, by no means it killed Bennett, he is still very strong and used in many teams, but in bigger picture he is not as popular as before. Let's take a look at another example and let's this time examine buffed character Kokomi. If you don't know, on release she was extremely useless and people kept skipping her banners. The problem was that healers weren't as popular as shielders and applying Hydro in big area wasn't really needed. Thus Hoyo made several attempts to fix it. First of them wasn't very successful, but let's still cover it. Shields on top of protecting you provide crowd control resistance, and since Hoyo didn't want to remove second rate, they had to compromise protection. During Inazuma they added Rift Hounds as new enemies. Every hit of theirs applies debuff called Bleed that constantly deals damage to all of your characters and completely ignores shields. While it did achieve lowering popularity of shields a bit, instead of playing healers, players preferred controlling those wolves or just brute forcing them. Second thing they did was actually previously mentioned release of Dendro. Both Bloom and Hyper Bloom reactions tend to scale very well with amount of targets affected. Till this day there is no better AU or field Hydra applier than Kokomi, so she strives in Dendro based teams. Wouldn't be wrong to say that Kokomi is one of those characters that took Bennett's spot. Let's take a look at another buff, this time it's gonna be Noelle. Noelle received many indirect buffs since release, so I think she's the best character to showcase all other ways Hoyo can buff a character. Geo was always one of the weakest elements, and to fix it a little back in 1.3, Hoyo completely reworked Geo Resonance. It wouldn't be wrong to say that it's the single strongest resonance that's currently in the game, some teams play double Geo just because of that. It of course did help Noelle a bit, but at the time there wasn't many Geo characters fitting in her team. Thankfully later Yunjin and Goro got released that fit that role. Both, despite not being released specifically for Noelle, had great synergy with her kit, and that way made Noelle team a lot stronger. A little later Husk was released, which was another way for Hoyo to buff Geo DPSs. Previously Noelle used Gladiator or Bolide, so this was a huge improvement. Noelle was stronger than ever before, but it still wasn't quite enough. Before we move on to the last buff, let me explain why Noelle was so weak to begin with. First of all, it's of course absolutely not reactive Geo. Most teams are based around certain elemental reactions, and Noelle had none. She was also designed as jack of all trades. She is a DPS, shielder and a healer. Not only shielder or healer usually occupy only one spot on the team, but even that one additional spot had nobody to fill it with. And Fontaine in 4.2 introduced a character that completely fixed that problem. Of course I'm talking about Furina. Not only she is the best possible buffer for Noelle, but she also requires a healer on the team. That way Noelle alone was able to fulfill requirements, while also having a shield to protect her from crowd control. It won't be wrong to say that Noelle's kit fit Furina more than that of any other character in the game. Of course, none of these changes were made specifically for Noelle, they just happened to align on her. But these and other similar buffs happen all the time, they are just targeting different characters. Only difference is that none of those characters needed buffs as much as Noelle. To sum up, there are several things that Hoyo can influence to make characters more or less relevant. First of all, it's the team. They influence it by releasing characters that either synergize well or on the contrary body the targets. Second, elements. By introducing new reactions or characters that support them, they push previously unplayed teams and raise popularity of characters they consist of. Third, artifact sets. This one is pretty straightforward. New, stronger set that fits a character is gonna make them stronger. And lastly, enemies. They often can be weak or resistant to certain type of characters. Even though it's usually not as impactful since Hoyo can't just spam one kind of enemies, it still plays its role. Of course, these are not the only ways of balancing, but they are by far the most present. What I love about them is that everything is indirect and almost always happens slowly over time. Because of that, buffs and even nerfs don't seem sudden and annoying, but rather feel natural as a part of character's life. And for today that's it. I hope this video was interesting and maybe even taught you something new. If that's the case, please consider subscribing and checking other videos on my channel. And as always, I'll see you guys in the next video. Have a great day.